Dan, I got my socks on. The one piece of swag you all want to leave with, if I can get my pants back on, is a pair of wee money socks. So go and see this man. He can help you with a range of financial solutions and socks. All right, this is our last session before we break for lunch. And we are running a couple of minutes behind, but that's cool because I think this is going to be fascinating. Is it really 10 years since Afterpay kicked off? In my head, that's probably about 400 repayments over that time. I know that when I was shopping on the Bunnings Marketplace just this morning for a battery replacement for my Dyson, I had the option. I didn't click on it on this occasion, Anne, but I know our family has used it so many times. It is the verb in our household. We do Afterpay. Well, this is something special. So we're going to go for as long as you guys are interested, as long as they're interesting. If you feel the need to go to lunch at 12 o'clock, please do. We'll be back, of course, at 1 o'clock after that. But I'm just going to hand over to amazing people, a unicorn founder. Of course, Anthony is the co-founder and co-CEO of Afterpay, which he launched in 2014 with Nick Molnar, listed on the ASX in May 2016. I think you all probably know what happened next, but I'm going to let you tell that story. His current role is Executive Chairman of Afterpay Touch Group for 2 years, and then a board member of the Tech Council of Australia, Director of the Life Foundation New Zealand Limited, and Stone and Chalk. Simone, we heard from a little earlier today. Of course, she's a former chair of FinTech Australia, has her own amazing company. They've been New Yorkers, parents, building amazing fintechs. Please put your hands together. A huge cheer for Simone and Ant. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning again, everybody. And good morning, Anthony.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Look, I've got to say, this is a pretty exciting opportunity to unpack 10 years as a founder. You're one of a group of few founders in Australia that have really made a big impact on the industry. And in fact, I would say that Afterpay even in some way defined the fintech industry on your pathway through. And we will talk about that. But I want to talk about you first and your personal journey as a founder. I'd like to know some moments that stood out, both shining good moments and those near death, this is it. Do you have some good moments that you can recall for us?
Yeah, we need a lot of time. But look, it's interesting. I mean, nothing short of just being grateful and blessed to, grow up in Australia, have amazing parents and a network around me that, you could just do different things and you could grow and learn in an incredible environment. So, that's the bedrock of everything. But in terms of being a founder, to be honest with you, did my career completely in reverse. I started life really, as an accountant and then as an investment banker. And then as a hedge fund investment guy. And I spent 15 odd years of my life, 20 years of my life, advising effectively companies what to do, and then spent quite a bit of time investing investors' money in companies that I thought I knew what it took to run a company or start a company or do these sorts of things. The greatest quirk of fate, to be honest with you, was buying a house during this process that I couldn't afford, but my wife really liked it. I didn't love it so much, but I lived across the road from the parents of a young man who ended up being, the most incredible co-founder of a business I could ever imagine. Incredibly unlikely that I thought I'd ever partner with somebody who was 18 years younger than myself, and you'd find that person there, but it was completely in reverse. The point I wanted to get to was, always focused on business, always focused on really wanting to be successful, be entrepreneurial in these things. But it came out from something that couldn't have been planned at the same token. But if you're a founder of a business and you're growing a business, when I say I did my career in reverse, I realised how incredibly challenging and uplifting it is to start something from scratch. And there's a lot of people that can say they can advise on that process, like that's what I did. But to live through it and grow through it is a completely different thing. So, there's probably more challenges than there are successes, but that's been kind of my history.
What on earth made you leave the cushy, cosy, relatively secure life of an investment banker and join with the kid across the road?
Always, well, a couple of things. I'd love, to be honest, to tell you that I was just completely brave and I just jumped into it and said enough was enough. But like a lot of things, when change happens, sometimes it's inspired, sometimes it's circumstantial. The investment fund that I was running during the global financial crisis kept going, and it was kind of fine, but whoever's in this room that's old enough to have lived through the global financial crisis in a capacity of business knew that, that was a huge time of change. And, we've had COVID, which was very interesting, but to me, my greatest learning was through this global financial crisis. And it just put a whole lot of different things into different perspectives. Fortunately, I was at a stage of life where I could make a choice. It's hard to jump out of things when you can't make a choice, when you're under ridiculous financial pressure for whatever reason that, it makes it very hard to move out. It was just at a good stage of life where there was a change in the environment. And when you saw what happened to a lot of people go through the global financial crisis, it sparked an idea around, well, how could you look at what was a generational shift at the time?
So after you've made this decision to join with the kid across the road, was it all smooth sailing, or did you have moments where you went, okay, this is it, today's the last day that we'll be working for Afterpay?
Yeah, plenty. The number of times I came home and told my wife, like, we're stuffed, it's all over. There's probably too many junctures to mention. I've realised one thing, and I'm borrowing this quote of somebody much smarter and more experienced, but success comes just from solving problems and getting out of near-death experiences, or just experiences that are uncomfortable and difficult. There were plenty. We didn't really have any money at the start of this. We had our own money, but we didn't have millions and millions of dollars to hire teams and just invest. But we were blessed with a company called Touch Corp based in Melbourne, who had an amazing founder who has now passed, Adrian Cleve, who, just the best experience of humanity would somebody who looked you in the eye and saw your passion and said, I want to back you, we'll use our team, you need to provide working capital and these sorts of things, but really, really give it a go. But, early on I remember that basically it was my house that was funding our receivables book right at the start.
That's all right, you didn't like it anyway. So.
So the first moment was, some of you would have known now, a company called Princess Polly, which was a clothing retail business, amazing founders, digital first company, couple based in Queensland, gone along to do great things. But at the time when we started, they were just starting. And I told Nick, mate, we've got to prove this model somehow. Just get me 5 retailers and let's do 20 transactions a day. And he said, okay, we'll get it. the first retailer turned us off within I think 3 days. But then we met this incredible company called Princess Polly. And instead of doing 20 transactions a day, we started doing 100 transactions a day, and then 200 transactions a day, and then 300 transactions a day. And it was like, Nick, let's think about this for a second. This company sells on average $70 dresses for very young ladies who, if they order on a Tuesday, get it by Friday so they can wear it on Saturday night. And we haven't met these people before, and they're going to pay us back in 4 installments over 8 weeks. And if I multiply 300 transactions a day by $80, and we're going day after day after day here, and it's only been 3 or 4 weeks, but this is my mortgage. Do you think they'll pay us back? And Nick said, "Don't worry about it." But there were all these things. We weren't growing fast enough. Everybody talks about Afterpay as being this meteoric rise, which it was at some point, and then compounding was...
Year 1, year 2? What are we talking here?
Year 2.5. Year 2.5, probably. We started in 2014, but we were building the tech in 2012, 2013. So by the time we got to this Princess Polly example, there was a lot of moments where it was like, are we actually going to even launch this? Is it going to be in the style and the method that we thought? But, the challenges come. But then when the tap starts with a drip and then it goes to a flow, we didn't have enough money. So the race was, how on earth do you get enough money by the holiday season at Christmas time? Because by that stage, we'd have to turn merchants off at some stage. And we were in this crazy situation where it was actually easier to go public and raise the money that we needed than it was to try and see if there was a venture capital partner or other sorts of things. So as a very, very young company, we went public on probably a valuation that we hadn't even grown into, even though it was mild compared to where it got to. But that came with ridiculous pressure. ASIC stopped our prospectus when we lodged it, and things around licensing and regulation, bore its head immediately from the start. Some of it all for very good reason, and some of it probably a little bit unfairly in hindsight and competition-based, but we had lots of these junctures.
We were going to get to this in a little bit, but I'm going to pick up on this now. What you've just said really highlights the importance to me of a rich, brave and prolific early stage investor landscape in Australia. Do you think if you had more options in hindsight, that going public might not have been something that you chose to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think over the last 10 years, venture capital has come a long way, but more private investing has come a long way. And just the acceptance and not just the perception, but the experience of investing in early stage companies still carries with it huge risk, but also, I think, huge reward as well. But there's been more examples of making it a worthwhile sector to invest in. But at the time when we started, we only survived because I had done banking and investing for 20 years. And, that came with some network, some idea about corporate organisation, how to put a board together, how to really apply proper corporate governance, as well as all. You need to do all of that, but that's actually adjacent to the only thing that really matters as a startup, which is, in our case, more merchants and more customers and people loving and accepting what you're doing, trying to break an inertia, trying to exist in a market that didn't exist before was the main game. But to even attempt that, you needed this periphery around it. So it was extremely limited. And I think it forced us in a position where we had a huge amount of pressure. I don't regret the opportunity because it unlocked everything. But going public very early isn't an easy thing to endure.
Okay, let's talk about regulators. Did you ever think that you would gear up for such a battle with the Australian regulators in the public realm as Afterpay engaged in?
No, I was naive to all of it, if I'm being very honest. If there's a lot of founders in this room, going through a Senate inquiry after you've launched a business and just gone public isn't fun. You know, it's difficult. But I've learnt a huge amount. And I think when you talk about regulation, you've got to think about it in a wider perspective, but at the time when you're just trying to exist and you believe in what you're doing, it's a really hard thing to comprehend. I mean, what I learnt and what I still firmly believe in is regulation is to protect consumers. It's not to protect incumbents, or that shouldn't be the design of it. And it was very interesting when we launched that it probably was a little inconvenient that the first time probably in Australia's history that we ended up having millions of consumers that weren't attached just to a big four bank in a new area that was very different in its dynamic, but still relatable as it was about money. So it was really, really difficult for us to explain what we were doing to regulators, even though to us it seemed so simple. But what I learned through the process was when you had the opportunity to at least build enough infrastructure that you could engage with politicians and regulators and different stakeholders the right way, then the story became more understandable. And we started to have, I think, very good discussions. I think the pressure of competition and regulation was something that we faced very strongly. But on the other hand, I couldn't sit there and say regulation is not important. It is absolutely important. And I actually think the government, particularly now even as it continues, is doing a very good job to try and synthesize between these aspects of what is in the interest of consumers from a competition and choice perspective, as well as the things that just blatantly protect consumers, which will always be important. But look, it's very difficult when this gets played out in the newspapers. It's very difficult when you're trying to explain your story. It's very difficult when somebody says that you exist because of a loophole in regulation, when to ourselves and to all the people that knew us, we knew exactly what we were trying to do. The regulated financial industry in Australia created the gap that allowed us to have this opportunity. The global financial crisis, which we spoke about before, highlighted why tech-based innovation in payments and FinTech was so important. When you look at the availability of what tech provides to introduce different models, we're like, this is entirely about consumers. This is entirely about choice. In our example or case, it was really interesting about learning how to speak about what we were trying to do. If we looked at the credit card industry in Australia, which pre-existed Afterpay and a huge number of companies that exist at this conference at the moment, you know, what we were trying to explain is the basic model is this. Some consumers have to lose for other consumers to win. So if everybody paid back their credit card balance at the end of the month, very simply, the credit card industry couldn't exist. With Afterpay, we simply wanted to turn the model on its head. and make more money as a company if everybody paid on time, as opposed to make more money when they didn't. And it took many, many goes, to be honest with you, just to relate what we were about in something that was very new. We knew intrinsically that we could prove that actually most people in a defined system were good and not bad. And I know that sounds ridiculously simple, but traditionally the finance industry is based on assuming people are bad and not good. And it appealed to a generation that wanted to look through very simple structures and understand a different sort of value proposition. It's hard to explain that and then also prove it at the same time, but you do. So you need the data to say people aren't abusing the system, loss rates are low, and all of these things. But while it's very difficult to navigate these paths as a very immature company, before you've worked everything out, I'd never say regulation isn't important. It crucially is. But as you're building a business, what we learned over time was it has to be part of your business. If you're involved in any area that's involving consumers, money, and contracts, it just has to be part of your business. And to the extent that you could build a muscle around your business where it was about engagement, transparency, and really being open book around your data, that was the approach that we ended up taking. And over years, I think that's worked well. Regulation still has ways to go, but as long as it keeps focused on the consumer at the end of the day and not preventing competition, I think that's where the line has to be drawn.
I think that rather public battle, as you say, played out in newspapers across the country. It was a lot of the general public's first awareness and interaction with a fintech as a concept. And I think that really, it seemed to spike up around COVID. I know it was happening before that and it continued across and after. Were you aware at the time that you were really pioneering the public awareness campaign for fintech as well as fighting your own battle?
Not at all.
Well, you were.
Not at all. There's a couple of things that become apparent, some of it in the moment, some of it in hindsight. But the biggest sort of lightning bolt around that is your team. And for me, it was when we expanded to the US. Afterpay would never exist if it was just sort of Nick and I at the start. We've had incredible people take a risk on us, leave other organisations, come together to build a team, whether it was tech, product, marketing, sales, etc. But what was really interesting is when we expanded to America. And before we went there, Nick and I went to San Francisco. You land there and you look for Silicon Valley. You don't know you're there. There's no landmarks that says now you're in Silicon Valley. There was actually a poster at the airport that says if you're a tech developer, come to Canada, which I thought was weird. But you look around and you're intimidated. It's not a landmark. It's not anything like that. It's just a mindset, and it's a community that you can't quite visualize by walking in the street, but when you see the companies and the level of talent and all the rest of it and the amount of activity, the amount of money that's going on there, you picture it more as a mindset. And when we had our team from Australia go to America, we obviously hired in America, it was pretty incredible because they were intimidated even more than we were with the decision to try and expand there. But when we saw great Australian talent go to the US and pound for pound be able to build and scale a platform just as well as anybody around the world. You think this is kind of incredible. The most amazing thing about technology to me, and this is again in hindsight, not in the moment, is that it actually is borderless to a certain extent. When I was growing up in Australia and in business, you know, Australia was always a very hard place to do business because it was so far away. So when you're moving physical goods and doing other things, the logistics of just what Australia was with its population just made it difficult. I know people always say that we've got great talent in Australia, but we really do. We don't have the same experience level. And we don't have the same experience at scaling to the extent that US and other companies do. But it can be accessed and it can be done. So to me, in hindsight, not in the moment, to your question, seeing that really inspires you around the fact that anything that can be created here. I mean, we literally started this from my kitchen table with Nick coming across the road for breakfast. I remember what I made him and just sort of dreaming about what we could possibly do. There's so many millions of steps between that and where you get to, but there is a fintech opportunity in Australia. There's just a technology opportunity in general that's available. It needs luck, it needs capital, it needs people who love you and have an amazing team around you to support you. But the talent here is great. And if you can just get to that sort of stage, then I think it can be really, really inspiring. That happened as we were solving problems, as we were trying. So it was very unconscious at the time. But to be honest with you, in the last 10 years, Australia's building amazing companies. You know, there were a few examples at the time when we were starting, but I think there's so much exciting stuff going on and a lot's happened.
There is. I very much agree with that, and this festival is testament to the exciting companies we have being built. I want to quickly turn to your acquisition. I think it was one of the most highly valued acquisitions in history. Marty, is that right? Yep, it is. That's at the Afterpay. Okay, so did you go looking for a buyer?
We didn't. We just never had time either. It's a funny thing talking in hindsight, because the whole thing feels a little bit surreal, because I can't tell you, like, the day-to-day was a team approach. We got to 2,500 people, but it sort of still felt like a family, even though it was large. We didn't go looking for a buyer. We met Square, which is now called Block, in the US from a business collaboration point of view. Nick had pretty much moved to the US at the time, and there was just a massive alignment around what we were trying to do. When we ended up meeting Jack Dorsey and we were talking about just our businesses, he stopped, you know, halfway into the conversation to say, like, why do you actually exist? You know, what is the core purpose of why you exist? What do you want to change? What was wrong with it? So we talked about what we talked about at the start of your question around regulation and these things. What did we want to introduce from a consumer point of view? What was the problem we were trying to unlock? And Block at its core is all about empowering the consumer, financial empowerment. When you look at Square on the small business side, but when you look at Cash App, which has over 100 million subscribers in the US, it's all about financial empowerment. And when we looked at what was very simply the things that made a difference to a consumer or a two-sided network, when you look at merchants and consumers, the ambition behind that and what we were trying to unlock was a mirror image. We were coming from different styles of product, but there was just complete alignment. So it was really born out of that. We didn't have a tender process. We didn't do all of those sorts of things. We spoke for about a year before it actually...
So it wasn't super fast?
We started talking a year before the deal was done, or announced, I should say. So yeah, it was pretty organic. But a few things like COVID and Apple announcing they were coming into the market, PayPal announcing they were coming into the market, was all undulations through some of these discussions while the sector was getting big at the same time.
If Jack hadn't had that conversation with you, do you think that you would have continued on the path that you were on? Did you have another plan?
I think we would have continued on the path that we're on, but the path that we were on was always changing. It's hard to really answer completely with knowledge that question, because for us it was just about sort of continuing, but we were compounding at such a big rate. The growth rate that we were experiencing was still 50% plus year on year, even when people thought we were sort of mature in Australia. COVID was an absolute left field event for most companies. When I first got back from the US doing a roadshow, there was that 2-week quarantine that was imposed, and our stock price dropped 80% on my drive from the airport to get to somewhere to stay for 2 weeks at the start of COVID, and everyone thought, we were going bankrupt. Everybody else was sort of going out of business. It's interesting when you look at it that a few months later, COVID became an incredible tailwind for our business, which is hard to take benefit of when so many people were suffering. But then COVID changed the landscape dramatically as well. And then post that, even the market for technology and how things are valued and where we are in the cycle has changed dramatically as well. Yes, I think we would have just continued. The company Afterpay is still experiencing, tremendous growth, as has been reported. But the dynamic in the market that we're experiencing was always changing. So, I guess my point is, I think to a lot of the companies that are here and the discussions that I've had as well is, you're going to have good cycles, you're going to have terrible cycles. Money will be plentiful, then you'll be starved of it. And there'll be every single problem in between. But I think if you can just keep going in the journey, it does work out if what you're doing is relevant at the end of the day.
I suppose we should probably get to wrapping up because everyone's probably starving, speaking of being hungry. What do you think are the key factors of you as a person that contributed to the success of Afterpay? We were talking about resilience before we came on stage. Is that one of them, or is there something else that you have and Nick has that complemented?
Look, I think it's a couple of things. I don't know if we've got brilliant resilience, to be honest with you. I think we've got a force of will. So we'll never stop trying. But to be honest, we also wear our heart on our sleeves. So I think being a little bit vulnerable is really important. For me, it was having actually a partner, because it's hard. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room experience, particularly when you're leading a startup company, it's a really lonely place, because when you have your doubts, you don't want that with your small team or your medium-sized team, and it's really quite difficult. But I think where Nick and I learned from each other, and for us it was pretty special, is that we could just relate as people to each other, but also to our team who we were relying on. So I think it's a combination of having this almighty force of will, but it's also being a little bit vulnerable as well, because you can't sprint a marathon. You can't do it all on your own. It is really hard. There are multiple days where you go home and say, it's over. So to be able to have a little bit of an escape valve for that, I think is pretty important too.
Thank you. Founder mental health is something that's so important and has not received the attention it's deserved over the last 10 years. One final question. Did your wife use Afterpay?
Yeah, she used it. My 21-year-old daughter particularly uses it. Yeah, it's funny. Nick and I always have competitions about which family is using it more or less, and where everybody's using it.
All right, well, look, thank you so much. I have so many more questions that we didn't get time to ask, but very grateful for giving us your time today, and congratulations on one of the most amazing journeys as a person and as a company over the last 10 years.
Thank you so
Very
much.
proud.
Thanks for having me.